Both new head coaches at Washington State and South Dakota State were introduced this past week. And while moving forward, I'll be focusing more on South Dakota State. I wanted to give my final thoughts on everything that's occurred in the last 2 weeks with Jimmy Rogers' departure. When Stig and I sat down and spoke about a year and a half ago about the book that I'm now writing and the vision for it, I told him that I wanted it to be his biography, but also wanted it to be a book where I could tell the story of the program as a whole. And if you know Stig, as important as he's been to the university and the program, he will deflect credit. It's about the individuals that helped him along the way that have also been a part of the football program. And one of those guys who's had a huge impact is Jimmy Rogers. Outside of Stig, there is no one in the book that I dive more into as a person and telling their story than Jimmy Rogers. And one of the guys I spoke to about Jimmy was Ernest Jones. Ernest Jones played in the NFL, and when he was done playing and retired, moved down to Arizona and began training high school kids. And one summer he had about 10 to 12 kids, and by the end of the summer, after putting them through absurd workouts, and I mean absurd, he only had one kid who continued to show up, Jimmy Rogers. I hope the quotes in the book from Ernest give you an idea of the kind of gusto that he spoke about with Jimmy. He said to this day he has never seen a kid more dedicated and work harder than Jimmy. When Jimmy got to college, the coaching staff would finish up their film study on Sunday night for their upcoming opponent. When they finished, Jimmy would then come into the trailers, do his own film study, do his own scouting report. Stig told me, and he said, I'm not exaggerating, Jimmy knew the upcoming opponent as well, if not better, than our coaching staff. When Jimmy was the head coach, whatever the punishment was that he'd have to hand down to a player, a lot of times he would do the punishment with them. He'd run the stairs with them. The guy is wired differently, and I try and make that clear in the book with some of the other stories I have in there. He's insane. He's actually insane, and I mean that in a positive way. Even I can speak myself. I've done over 115 interviews now for this book that I'm writing. I'm serious. There hasn't been an individual who can recall details from 5 to 10 to 20 years ago in their lives like Jimmy. It's weird. And getting to know him a decent amount, from speaking with people about him to even speaking with him, I've had a lot of cool conversations with him where he's been transparent with me about his life and what once was his current job as the head coach of the Jacks. And it allowed me to see behind the scenes and understand how things work. And I promise you, that guy deeply cares about South Dakota State football. I promise you he wants to see Dan Jackson succeed. Dan was in Jimmy's wedding. And if you heard Jimmy's presser at Washington State, he is a loyal guy. But I think maybe more than anything else, what Jimmy is most loyal to is winning. He will win at all costs. He's trying to build an immediate winner at Washington State, and if that comes at the expense of his alma mater, so be it. Including recruits, he's now brought 25 players with him from South Dakota State to Washington State. Would have been more if everyone they wanted had followed them to Washington State. Obviously, the whole coaching staff is gone, which great opportunity for some of those guys. But with all this said, you've created some major unstableness at South Dakota State. Now, Barry Dunn, Justin Sell have done a really good job of righting that ship, but you can't expect people to not be upset, and rightfully so. Like, as you, Jimmy Rogers, move on, these people are still here. This is still the team and the program that they will support day in and day out, week in and week out. And I can understand how people would be mad, sad, unhappy with seeing it kind of be dismantled before their eyes. I also wanted to make mention of my story this past week that I published on my Medium page featuring comments from Quentin Christensen and Chase Mason, who spoke candidly, and they should be commended for it. It's nice to hear athletes speaking open and honestly, but I wanted to call out myself. I did not even reach out to Rogers or anyone on that former staff asking if they wanted to comment on the current story I was writing. There's two sides to every situation, and that is a poor job on my end. I reached out to Rodgers 2 weeks ago when he took the Washington State job, asked if he wanted to talk about everything, said he didn't have time. I figured he wouldn't have time this time around, and that's a poor excuse. So for the entire coaching staff and Rodgers, who did treat me well during the last 2 years in Brookings, I did not treat you as I'd like to be treated, and for that I apologize. To wrap everything up, fascinated to see how Rodgers does at Washington State. We don't yet know if he's a great head coach. We don't. He was handed the keys to a Ferrari at South Dakota State, not the same situation in Pullman. He'll have to build them into a championship contender. It will take some people some time around here to come around to it, but what he did as a player to the time he put in as a coach, I know it was a tough exit, but people should be pulling for Jimmy Rodgers in Washington State. And on that note, as far as pulling for a team, in 2025, when that South Dakota State football team takes the field, I expect there to be a certain amount of pride and juice in that crowd that we have maybe never felt before in Dana J. Dykhouse Stadium.